In today's video, I'm going to be sharing with you all about Samhain, the Celtic fire festival and cross-quarter Sabbat on the wheel of the year. So if you're interested to find out all about this incredible celebration that many witches and pagans adore, including history, folklore, celebrations, Halloween, things that you can do to celebrate at this time of year, magic that you can practice, and a recipe for a delicious pumpkin pie, all coming your way. Do get yourself a nice warm drink, settle back, relax and enjoy. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm so excited for this video. I think that this is probably going to be the most exciting video of this Sabbat series that I have been filming over the last year or so, and I really enjoyed delving further into the folklore, and I think as I progressed throughout the wheel of the year I've delved even deeper into the history and the folklore and discussed that a little bit more. That's definitely something that I do want to continue to do on the channel. I think it's so interesting every year to go deeper into reading and discovering all about the seasons, and especially, you know, connecting to your land as well, wherever you are, and building up your own sort of wheel of the year, considering where you are, the land you're on, and what works for you. And today we're going to be discussing Samhain, and this is commonly mispronounced. It is a Gaelic word meaning summer's end. It was in the early 20th century that some scholars did posit that the word Samhain actually derived from the Gaelic word Sarthin, which I probably mispronounced and I apologise, and that meant fire of peace. That does seem to make sense because it is a Celtic fire festival as well as a cross-quarter Sabbat on the wheel of the year. So in Ireland, Samhain is known as Iha Hauna, Samhain Night. This is essentially when the Ausshi, the fairies, were said to be abroad and out in the night, just as in Bealtaine, May's Eve. The wheel of the year is a contemporary pagan creation that was created by Aidan Kelly in 1974. The Wheel of the Year is made up of a number of different celebrations that would have been celebrated by different people in different places, but not all of them were celebrated in the same way. Some of them are much more ancient festivals than others. I've gone in depth into this in some other videos. The Wheel of the Year is made up of solar festivals, including the summer solstice and the winter solstice, as well as the spring and autumn equinoxes, and then the cross-quarter days are the days that fall in between, which are typically Celtic fire festivals. And we do see this common thread throughout several of the Sabbats, where a bonfire is created and used as a central location for celebrations, as well as protection, to protect the land, to protect the crops, to protect the people and the animals, the livestock, etc. So that has been a custom that has followed through. I do plan on making a video dedicated to the Wheel of the Year at some point in the future soon. So the Festival of Samhain has several different spellings, which I will list below. It is also known to contemporary communities as Halloween, of course, and that is a secular celebration, as well as All Hallows Eve, All Saints Day and All Souls Day, which follow the consecutive days on November 1st and November 2nd. So Samhain falls on October 31st at dusk and runs until November 1st dusk. So it is that whole period of time. And there is some conjecture as well that some witches do celebrate on the full moon before Samhain, as well as October 30th as well. And I have said this in the other videos as well, I personally feel that it's really nice to elongate the celebrations so you can decorate, so you can have a feeling of the season in your house and in your heart and carry it with you. Do lots of seasonal baking, do lots of arts and crafts with your kids if you have kids, or with yourself, with your family, your friends, to really deepen into the themes of the time of the year and celebrate in the ways that are special for you. So I think that's really nice to celebrate over a period of weeks, a couple of weeks before and a couple of weeks after, perhaps, however long feels right for you. As a witch myself, I like to think of the season of the witch as starting really in September and running all the way through into November as well, until I start to feel that Yule feeling creeping in. That's my personal vibe. So as it is reflected in the name, Samhain is considered to be the end of summer, the start of winter, and in the historian Bede's reckoning of time, the month of October is listed as Vienna Philith, and this is an Anglo-Saxon description for the start of winter, essentially, the onset of winter. And interestingly enough, September was Halag Monoth, as we discussed in the Mabon autumn equinox video, which meant holy month. And interestingly also, November is known as blood month, Blood Monath, which I found really, really interesting. And I think that that is probably due to the slaughtering of livestock that occurs around Samhain time. So Samhain is also known to witches and pagans as the final harvest festival of the year. And it really is the end of the harvest season. And we are harvesting things like pumpkins and gourds and squashes. And that is the final sort of harvest time. And so pretty much all the other harvests are complete, and this was the time when people are making preparations for winter and starting to think about slaughtering the animals, the weaker animals that they are going to be consuming and preserving throughout the winter time to keep them sustained through the coldest months. So the ancient Celts, again, would have been honouring this idea of life and death, as we talked about in Bealtaine. It is a reflection of that, as it is on the axis of the wheel of the year. Beltane is at the opposite end, May's Eve. And it is really, really interesting, again, to bring this into question. The Celts would have been thinking about this, their livelihood, how they relate to the idea of death and how they remember their loved ones. So it was a time of turning inward. So it would have been a time when they were considering those cycles of life and death and what it meant to them. They would have been considering connecting to their ancestors and connecting to their beloved dead, as of course we do. Many witches and pagans do that today, as we'll discuss later. You can see these themes kind of continuing. As well as this, they would have been connecting to the gods and goddesses and honouring those gods and goddesses for the harvest that they have just reaped. And along those lines, it was also considered a time when the veil was thin. I'm sure many of you have heard of this before, and it is a time, again, at Bealtaine was considered the veil was thin and people were more able to connect with the fair folk, the fae, as well as ancestors and spirits, dearly departed loved ones. It is definitely a common conception that Halloween has evolved from the ancient pagan holiday of Samhain, and I would consider this to be in part true, as well as the Christianization then altering the celebration of Samhain into more Christian holidays, including All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day. It is thought that the ancient Celts, after they had finished the final harvest on the final full moon preceding Samhain, hence why I believe that many witches and pagans do celebrate on that full moon before, it is thought that they had a bonfire. They would have made prayers and offerings to the gods to appease the gods. An offering of one of the animals to slaughter to the god is thought to have been practiced in order to appease those gods and thank them, and again ask for more protection and blessings throughout the season of winter to keep them again sustained. They also would have erected a crom cruach, which was a stone pillar in the likeliness of a god. It was thought to symbolise the sun, almost as a totem and an emblem of blessing for the coming spring. It was also thought that each family would return home with a branch lit from the sacred fire, and they would use that to then light the candles in their own home. This folklore then developed into further rites and rituals where people would have a shared fire and pass their candle flames from house to house to connect the communities together. And it is a beautiful rite that we can continue as pagans today in covens or with friends, family, and you can even keep a sacred flame alit yourself by starting a candle and using that candle always to relight the next candle and the next candle and the next candle. So it is a really, really beautiful thing to do if you can. It is also thought that the ancient Celts would have dressed themselves as animals or fearsome beasts in order to keep the fairies away. So Christianity spread and the holidays became Christianized. It was in the 5th century that Pope Boniface attempted to repurpose the idea of honouring the spirits of the dead by moving it into May and turning it into a holiday to honour the saints and the martyrs. However, the festivals continued in earnest, and in the 9th century, Pope Gregory moved it right back to the original date. The church named November 1st as All Saints' Day in an attempt to appease, again, the pagans, to allow them to connect and to celebrate the souls they had lost. And it was alternatively called All Souls' Day as well. And eventually these two would become two different days, because originally they were intended to remember those who were considered to have been Christian, rather than including every spirit or soul. However, these two holidays then separated out, and All Souls' Day then fell on the 2nd of November to honour all souls. As with many of the Sabbats, including the ancient fire festivals, where arguably we have slightly more, in some cases, of a picture of how this time may have been celebrated, we still have questions as to when and how things were adopted and what influenced something else. Ronald Hutton is really fantastic at unpacking some of the nuance of this within Stations of the Sun, and explains that really the problem with the idea that Christianity took over and therefore then appropriated the ancient pagan celebrations and turned them into the Christian holidays. The problem is that in different parts and different places, Christianity and the Roman calendar would have entered these places at different times in history. By many scholars, it was sort of considered to be inconclusive. However, Sir James Frazer did build upon historian Rees's theories to explain a little bit more. His notion was that Samhain was the original festival of the dead, and that, I believe, is something that I think many of us would consider to be true. However, again, it's something we can't be sure about. Sir James Frazer's argument was that there was never a Christian celebration like that, and therefore it must have been taken from the pagans. And as previously mentioned, Ronald Hutton does discuss this at length, goes into greater detail. It's very interesting. If you would like to read it, it is Stations of the Sun. It was in the 19th century that the Ulster Protestants from Ireland came over to the USA and brought with them all of their festivities and folklore for this time of year. And that is when we started to see the celebrations start to look a little bit more like the Halloween we know today. So this included parties and celebrations with children and families dressing up, lots of games and lots of courtship. In the 1930s, this is when pranking started, and it was around the 1970s when it became more of a holiday for everyone, not just for children. Diana Rachel actually makes the very interesting observation in Llewellyn's Sabbat series Samhain book that it's actually very interesting that many of the observations that appear to be quite pagan, such as trick-or-treating, actually did derive from more of a Christian community, whereas what is seemingly more spiritual, connecting to spirits and dearly departed, is actually much more related to the pagan celebrations. So it's thought that the Celtic fire festival element of the celebration continued throughout the centuries, really, into the Middle Ages, and became very much a protective measure as well as a celebration, as we've discussed previously. In Welsh folklore, the bonfires were thought to scare off the fairies specifically. This is around the time that we start to see people carrying lanterns, and these were usually crafted from a carved turnip, which is actually apparently really hard to carve. I've never actually tried to carve a turnip myself. I find it hard enough to carve a pumpkin, so I probably won't be trying that, but apparently really, really difficult, and I personally think they look so ghoulish. So these were carved out and carried on strings, and they became known as jack-o'-lanterns, and this referred to an old Christian story of old Jack, who was considered to be the most evil man who ever lived. He was a blacksmith who was considered to be so evil that not heaven nor hell would have him. There was more folklore in Wales and in Britain, with people having long bonfires throughout the night and even rolling wheels of fire down hills. That custom actually still occurs in various places in the country, and I actually live about 15 minutes away from a place that is very famous for this holiday observance celebration around this time of year, and it's called the Tar Barrels. It usually happens around Bonfire Night. It's something I've never been to because when we moved here I had small children, so that's not something you want to take your small children to, but potentially one day I might go, although it does sound really terrifying. So between sort of 18th and 19th century, there's a lot of folklore that's been recorded around Great Britain and Scotland and Wales around these bonfires and the kind of celebrations that the folk had around these bonfires and what sort of rituals occurred. So Ronald Hutton talks about this quite extensively in Stations of the Sun, and in Perthshire it was recorded that each member of a family would have a branch of fir wood that was lit from the bonfire, and they would turn it sunwise to protect themselves. In some places these branches were also thrown into the bonfire, and they would shout, "Brave bonfire, burner, keep the fairies away." In the Moray, it is recorded that boys would beg for fuel for the fire in order to burn the witches. One piece of history that I absolutely love is the record of Queen Victoria herself on Halloween in 1874, celebrating a bonfire at Balmoral, and within that bonfire there was an effigy of a witch that was being burned, and the party were all dressed as fairies, which I think I would just love to have been there. That just sounds epic. I mean, clearly Queen Victoria knew how to throw a party, let's just give her that. In Welsh folklore, it was also recorded at a tinley, which is what it was referred to as, that members of the community would place a stone in the ashes in a circle. The next morning, if that stone had been moved, the community felt that this person had been claimed by the fair folk, which actually sounds quite terrifying. If I was a child, that sounds pretty scary. I think a lot of this, again, like going back to some of the previous Sabbats, it seems like a lot of superstition and fear-mongering in order to keep children and women in line, really. The jack-o'-lanterns and these torches were intended to keep the witches and the fairies away. So as well as old Christian tales such as Old Jack, there were some other folk tales about some scary creatures that you might meet, including the fae, as well as the puka. So a creature that is often referenced that I think sounds quite a lot like the typical depiction of a horned god or a devil is the puka, as often spelt in different ways. It was said that the puka would soil all over the blackberries on Halloween night, and so after that time it was not a good idea to eat those blackberries. However, it's also said that on Michaelmas night in September that also occurs. So I believe that the puka is kind of around on these times. I personally probably wouldn't harvest blackberries after the equinox or so anyway, just to be safe. The puka was thought to be a fae or a spirit, a beast that would soil all over the blackberries and essentially curse whoever ate them, which is very, very pleasant. And I think it, yeah, again, just deters young children from picking the berries. But due to the fact that it occurs both on Halloween and on Michaelmas in September on the 29th, I believe that it is probably safer to just avoid them after the equinox. I think that that's a good way to go about it. That's just my thoughts on it. In Plants of the Devil, Corinne Boyer talks about Irish folklore and All Hallows Eve, how if one wished to invoke evil spirits, one was to go under a bramble arch on All Hallows Eve to make an invocation. By doing this, one could gain supernatural powers and abilities in exchange for one's soul. To have prophetic dreams on All Hallows Eve, a girl could search for a blackberry briar grown into a hoop, crawl through it 3 times in the name of the devil, and cut it in silence, taking a thorny piece home to sleep with it under her pillow. And that is also a reflection of another theme that is very present within this Sabbat, and it is divination, of course, and specifically divination around finding out your future spouse or your true love, and we will come to more of that in a bit. Also in the same book, Corinne Boyer discusses Scottish folklore, a method to gain a glimpse into the world of the fae, that one was to anoint oneself with the green juice of the inner bark of the elder tree on All Hallows Eve while standing near a fairy hill. A person would have to be baptised, however, for this method to work. And this was found in Mac Cottier's Irish Trees, Myths, Legends and Folklore. Very interesting indeed. Another method of divination performed on All Hallows Eve was an English love divination for a man to bring about prophetic dreams of his future wife, to gather 10 ivy leaves, throw one away, likely an offering to the devil, and sleep with the 9 remaining leaves under his pillow. This was also, again, from the same source. And there are many different types of these divination practices, of course, and they all occurred around All Hallows Eve. A 16th century poet, Alexander Montgomery, wrote in Scotland, "At the hind end of harvest, on Halloween, when our good neighbours ride, I think right, some mounted on a ragweed, and some on a bean, all tripping in troops from the twilight, some saddled on she-ape, all arrayed in green, some riding on hemp stalks." There's a reference to hemp, just to say. "Rising on high, the king of fairy and his courts with the elf queen, with many a weird incubus, was riding that night." In Norse culture, it was thought that the Hallowmas trolls would parade around and wreak havoc amongst cattle. At Longridge Fell in the Lancaster Pennines, it was recorded that they would walk the hillsides on Halloween until the early part of the century between 11 PM and midnight. Each carried a lighted candle, and if one went out, the holder would know that an attack from a witch was impending, and thus would be warned to take precautions. The custom was called lating, hindering the witches. There was also the Lady Gwen, or Wyn, who was known as the White Lady, who then later was thought to be the goddess Cerridwen. So the Lady in White was supposedly a female ghost who would appear dressed in white, sometimes headless. She was essentially lost and wandering in the night. And a popular folk song describes a tailless black sow and a white lady without a head. May the tailless black sow snatch the hindmost, a tailless black sow on winter's eve. Thieves coming along, knitting stockings. There are a number of stories about the White Lady and the folk who come into contact with the White Lady. In a lot of these stories, she's a victim of murder or of suicide, and she's a lost soul. There is also the legend of the Dullahan, or the Headless Horseman, and again, this figure was seen as an omen of death. There is also folklore around the Wild Hunt and the conjecture around who was leading the Wild Hunt, whether it be Woden or Odin. And this was, again, similarly to Beltane, like a parade of fairies emerging from a fairy mound and parading around. One should not get caught up in the Wild Hunt. Again, really, really interesting. If you're interested in those kind of folktales, I would highly recommend reading Gemma Gary's Silent as the Trees, which is folklore around Devon. And there is also a book, Witchcraft and Folklore of Dartmoor, which includes more information about those wild hunts as well. Again, the Wild Hunt was connected to a number of other stories, including King Arthur and King Herod. And there was also stories of unbaptized children or will-o'-the-wisps who would float around in the night, essentially. And again, that idea of a lost soul on that night and not meeting one of these creatures on that night. So we can see these themes of life and death, the idea of your soul being lost after death, the lanterns of the light to guide the way, the protective bonfires, and we can see almost how trick-or-treating evolved out of some of these older traditions, which started with things like mumming in Ireland and in Scotland, where the poor would parade around and offer songs and prayers in return for food, or soul cakes at the time. It was also known to be a type of folk theatre, as people would parade and put on shows. This custom was also known as souling or clementing. Some of the folk songs that were recorded from the 19th century read as follows. This was from Wales and the West Midlands. Soul, soul, for a soul cake, I pray good missus, a soul cake. An apple or pear, a plum or a cherry, any good thing to make us merry. 1 for Peter, 2 for Paul, 3 for him who made us all. Up with the kettle and down with the pan. Give us good alms and we'll be gone. That was recorded in Scotland and Scotsmen in the 18th century by John Ramsay. Another variety in Staffordshire went as follows. Soul, soul, for an apple or two. If you've got no apples, pears will do. If you've got no pears, halfpennies will do. If you've got no halfpennies, God bless you. And this was recorded in the statistical account Sinclair A. MacDonald, some former customs of the royal parish of Cathray. In Somerset, a song reads as follows. A soul for a soul cake, 1 for Jack Smith and 1 for Tom White, and 1 for myself, and I'll bid you good night. My clothes are very ragged, my shoes are very thin. I've got a little pocket to put 3 halfpence in, and I'll never come a souling till another year. There was then an educational reform in 1870, which meant that the children were in school, and this didn't really continue, at least in the daylight hours. Other celebrations as well as the bonfires included things like fireworks, as well as on October 30th it became a tradition that children in Somerset would go door to door and beg for money for fireworks, and this became known as Punkie Night, and this night was known as Mischief Night. And here we can see again how trick-or-treat sort of started to take shape. In Scotland, October 30th was known as Cabbage Night, and there were traditions of young people breaking in and stealing cabbages, of course. Why not? From fields and farms. And then the costuming as well, again, that tradition to dress up to keep those spirits at bay, those fairies, the goblins, the monsters, the spirits who had lost their way, to sort of disguise yourself. And again, I think that theme is very much understood today and the way we celebrate Halloween. Another form of folkloric protection that was used was a partial. October 31st and the 1st of November were considered to be quite dangerous nights. So all over Ireland, Wales and Scotland, people would take precautions, and these included protective measures, deploying flames, and the Southern Irish would rely upon a partial, a cross of sticks woven with straw, which was placed over the inside of the entrance to one's homes, which I think is similar to the rowan cross created out of rowan wood, or you can create rowan berry braids and necklaces on strings that you can hang up as well to protect your home. I think we can actually thank the Victorians quite a lot for Halloween being what it is today, and the kind of fun folkloric aesthetic we have around Halloween, and that comes down to the vintage images we have that were across all the media around that time of fun Halloween games and pranks, and included children and women, and it just kind of kept this fun alive. I think that's why it's such a big part of our culture now, and becoming a bigger part of the culture here in England. However, obviously being much more of a big thing in the US for a very, very long time, since the 1970s. So the Druids actually came up with a game called Snap Apple, and we can see a lot of apple games such as apple bobbing, bobbing for apples, and other activities and games and pranks that you can do with apples, including peeling an apple and throwing it over your shoulder, and then the idea that the peel would spell out the letter of the name of your future spouse. That kind of divination. Toffee apples as well. Apples are a massive, massive part of this holiday, as they are for Mabon, and a beautiful symbol for blessings, for love, and all of this abundance and bounty and joy and, you know, sweetness of life. So I really, really love apples for that, and there's so much folklore and so many correspondences connected to apples at this time of year. So in the game of Snap Apple, in its initial form, the host tied an apple to one end of a rope, threw it across a barn rafter, then tied a lit candle to the other end. Players had to catch the apple in his or her teeth without getting burned by the candle. That sounds so dangerous. Whoever won was considered to have a successful marriage. So it's divination in everything, really. It was said that women would take 2 seeds from the apple, place them on her cheek or eyelids after naming each of the 2 opposite states of fortune, for example, wealth or poverty, travel or home, marriage or spinsterhood. The first to fall off was the answer to the question. Then, of course, there's tradition of cutting the apple in half crossways so that the centre formed a star, a beautiful pentacle. It was said that the seeds within could predict certain things. So 2 seeds would predict an early marriage, 3 seeds would indicate wealth and inheritance, 4 would indicate travel, and 5 would indicate good health. 6 would indicate wisdom or fame, and 7 also indicated fame as well as a wish granted. So all of those seem quite good to me. It was also said that people would hold apples on a string over a fire, and the first apple to fall, that person would marry first, and the last to fall may not marry ever. Nuts were also used within divination and were thrown onto the bonfire, and if they crackled together they were considered to be connected really well, and if they bounced apart they were said to not be compatible. Kale and cabbage, again, also used to determine your future spouse. So the camera might be slightly different because the cat came in and was nuzzling the camera. What are you gonna do? One piece of folklore said that women may go to thresh wheat all day, and then at the end of a long hard day would receive visions of her future spouse. I mean, to me that just sounds like she's exhausted and potentially experiencing hallucinations. Another variation of this is that someone might spot an animal from the top of a roof. I'm not sure why on top of a roof, but that animal, the first animal that they see, was said to resemble and have features similar to that of their future spouse. A similar and ridiculous one was that a person was supposed to either shut their eyes or walk backwards from their house, and the first thing that they see when they open their eyes was said to indicate the nature of their coming year. So things that they might see that would be lucky were men on horses. Seeing a woman would foretell ill luck. That doesn't sound very fair to me. Anyone seeing digging or a bird with its head under its wing were also bad. It's really interesting. Again, the ashes of the bonfire were also considered to have a divinatory meaning. So those who were intended to marry were encouraged to blow onto the fire, and if the ashes went back into your face, it was considered to be an omen of a happy marriage. Several really interesting forms of divination were to call the person who you're supposed to marry's fetch to you, so you might see an image of them. And one popular spell on All Hallows Eve included a young woman sowing a row of hemp seed at midnight. As she sat and watched, the apparition of her husband would be to appear to furrow the seed. And in another version, a young woman would hang out her nightgown in front of the fire and then watch the room through a keyhole of a closed door, waiting to see the ghost of her future husband come and turn the garment. Or she might sit in front of her mirror at midnight. Again, I have seen this referenced in Graham King's book. This one just here, the British Book of Spells and Charms. A young lady was said to sit in front of her mirror eating an apple, and the image of her future husband was to appear behind her. That sounds so creepy. There were also variations including things baked into puddings and into dough and paper and water and apples in water and all kinds of other funny divinatory practices such as that. I do find it really, really interesting that so much of this fortune telling is about the future marriage, someone's romantic future. And I wonder if it's not so much romance that is important, maybe to the young women it is, but actually it's more of securing your future. As in, are you going to be okay fortune-wise? Are you going to meet and marry someone who is going to look after you and take care of you? Because in those days, that's kind of the life that women led, unfortunately. I believe that that almost reflects the theme that we see in the ancient pagan celebrations around Samhain, of preparing for the winter, looking into the future to see, you know, if they are going to be able to sustain themselves throughout that winter, and considering their future, because it was a matter of life and death. And also for women, marriage often would have been, I think, a key component in life or death, right? Because if you don't marry someone who is able to take care of you and, you know, provide for you and your family, then you're out on the street and then your livelihood is gone. So yeah, I think these are probably worries and anxieties that these women would have had at certain times. You know, thank goodness it is not like that now, and this is an idea that I've been mulling over after reading the history and the folklore, what's been recorded, and it is in no way to suggest that this is definitely the truth, but it is something I consider to be potential. You know, if this is what these people were divining for, it would seem to have specific relevance to the idea of maintaining one's livelihood. So we have a number of other holidays that many people will know about in other traditions. One of the most famous is, of course, the Mexican Day of the Dead, Dia de los Muertos. I absolutely love the Disney film Coco about the Mexican Day of the Dead and the family, and how that's very much more of a celebration honouring the life of those people and the importance of revering them and honouring them and remembering them and being joyful about the memories of them. I think that that's so beautiful and special. And of course, the bread of the dead that you can make, which is a Mexican bread of the dead that includes butter and orange and typically aniseed, but I personally don't enjoy aniseed, so I wouldn't bake it with that myself. There is also Guy Fawkes Night, which interestingly potentially has become the celebration that has replaced the bonfire at Samhain, as many of us don't really typically have a bonfire at Samhain now. In our communities, culturally, we tend to see the secular bonfire night to be firework night, to be Guy Fawkes Night on November 5th. Remember the 5th of November. Guy Fawkes Night is of course named after Guy Fawkes, who was a rebel and arguably a terrorist who attempted to blow up the Houses of Parliament. So now this day is celebrated with burning an effigy of Guy Fawkes on a bonfire. So then, early Irish literature from Dylan. I had my days with kings, drinking mead and wine. Today I drink whey water among the shrivelled old hags. Deep red the bracken, its shape all gone. The wild goose has raised its wonted cry. Cold has caught the wings of birds. Season of ice. These are my tidings. So let's talk about some correspondences. Herb and fruit and nut and food-wise and tree-wise, we have the following: pumpkins, apples, nuts, kale, turnips, cabbage, pomegranates, hemp seeds, cinnamon, aniseed, plums, cherries, pears, cedar, acorn, oak, corn, dittany of Crete, hazel, mullein, nightshade, sage, wormwood, and fumitory. In terms of gods and goddesses, there are so many deities related to this time of year that you can honour and work with at this time of year, depending on the pantheon of gods and goddesses that you do connect to yourself. So here are some that I have listed: the Horned One, Cernunnos, the Bukadu, the Holly King, the Green Man, the Dagda, Corridwen, Hecate, the Morrigan. The Dagda and the Morrigan, of course, had their meeting at the River Tunis on Samhain Eve, where they mated over the river. Persephone and Demeter, Hades, Pluto, Baba Yaga, Odin, Woden, Bertha, Holder, Bikaliak, Hel, Kalima, Ares, Ishtar, Inanna, Lucifer, Psyche, the Fates, Janus, Anubis, Isis, Osiris. I would also consider Bacchus and Dionysus to be deities that you could work with at this time of year as well. There are so many, depending on whether or not you work with deities and also what calls to you and who you work with predominantly, but there are so many deities that you could work with at this time of year. Of course, because of the themes of life and death and betwixt and between and honouring the dead and calling out to ancestors and the beloved dead, there is of course many chthonic deities included in this list, many deities who are associated with the underworld. So some things that you can do at this time of year, of course, a nature walk. I say this in all of the videos, but I think it's beautiful. The leaves are golden and red and just these lush brown, copper, golden hues, and it's just beautiful. Collect some of those. I actually saw someone online preserving leaves in glycerin. I thought that sounded like an excellent idea. Of course, put up twinkly lights, pumpkins, gourds, all manner of root vegetables such as turnips, pomegranates, all of those that I listed. You can decorate your altar with apples. You can create an ancestral altar as well, of course, if you don't have one that is up all year. You can perform divination. You can use tarot cards and oracle cards. You can use scrying with water, or scrying with water and oil, or scrying with water and candle wax. You could use a pendulum. You can use a crystal ball, scry into a crystal ball. You can use some of the divination methods that we've talked about in this that are folkloric and incorporate that into your practice if you do wish to do so. You might also wish to carve a pumpkin, save the seeds, clean them up, bake them in an oven, and then use the seeds for divination. You could use a cloth and divide it up, and depending on if you work with runes or if you work with the Ogham, something like that, you could devise your own divinatory system using things like that. Also natural things that you find in nature, such as sticks, stones, roots, bones, leaves, twigs, nuts, seeds, etc. You can also craft a lot at this time of year. Of course, there's crafts with children as well as for adults. You know, if you wanted to, you could craft yourself a partial. You could craft a rowan cross or a rowan berry wreath. You could also create a wreath on your door to protect against malevolent presences. You could perform a house blessing at this time of year as well. You can bake bread, which is my favourite thing to do, of course, as you've seen in many of these videos. You can make pies. I am going to be sharing with you a beautiful recipe for a pumpkin pie that I absolutely love to make, and the children love it as well, so I hope you enjoy that. You can create felted pumpkins, which I also love to do. I've shown those on my channel before. You can do apple printing, leaf printing. You can create garlands with pom-poms in the seasonal fall colours. You can create little lanterns with empty jars and Mod Podge or PVA glue and bright coloured tissue paper. I did that with my kids a few years ago and we love doing it. Definitely look on Pinterest. I always say that because there are so many fantastic ideas, especially for kids crafting. You can make things like sugar skulls, usually made out of almond paste or egg whites and sugar, and you can craft these beautiful, like intricately decorated designs. You can create your own ancestral masks, create a family tree or an ancestral tree where you delve deeper into your ancestral roots and discover more about your family line. Another thing that's beautiful, I think, to make at this time of year would be a besom, if you do wish to do so, and to stand it up at your door as a protective measure with the bristles up, of course. You can bake all manner of pumpkin cakes, apple breads, cinnamon rolls. You could bake soul cakes, or you can make an Irish bread, or you could make the Mexican bread of the dead. So many ideas. I'd like to share with you now my recipe for a beautiful pumpkin pie that I just love to make, so I really, really hope you enjoy that. So to start the pie, I'm going to make a sweet short crust pastry, and if you saw my Mabon video, the blackberry crumble pie I made, it's the same recipe, except it also has 1/3 of a teaspoon of pumpkin spice. I probably could have added a little bit more, but I just didn't want to go overboard with it. So this is 250 grams of plain flour, and I'm mixing in the pumpkin spice, and I'm also sifting this through. I like to put all of my intentions into all the ingredients, as with all of the food I make, especially when I'm baking for the family, usually around blessings for the home and the family, and this is for the coming season.
Me.
It's a ghost! It is so funny.
It's just a towel wrapped around me. I just said it father, daddy.
You did, you lucky bean!
Are you making the pumpkin pie now?
I am making the pumpkin pie, my darling. Would you like to give it a magic stir?
Oh yeah, a magic
Put a little bit.
Is there any magic ingredient?
Yes. Yes, look, I've put this pumpkin spice in it here. Look, come here and give it a little stir.
Oh, what's he calling it?
Do you want to give it a stir, baby?
Yes. Oh,
That's it. That's it. What Mummy likes to do is stir it this way, clockwise. Can you stir it clockwise? And think about all of the beautiful, joyful things we're going to do over winter. Can you do that? And how much we're going to enjoy Halloween together.
And to imagine what you wish if you do what you like.
Yes.
I wish it was Halloween.
It will be soon, my love. 75 grams of icing sugar, and we're going to sift that.
Now we pour it.
So what we need to do is pour it into the sieve there. That's it. Good work.
And now we shake it.
Yes, and this is sugary and sweet.
Sugary.
So think about all the sweet things we're going to eat and all the sweet joy we're going to have with the experiences we're going to have and all the fun as a family we're going to have. Yeah?
Yeah.
Good work. Next was just a little bit of a baking sing-song. Now, what you found, it's biscuits, it's gravy, babe. So I'm mixing the icing sugar in with the plain flour, and I've got 125 grams of cold butter, and I'm just going to cube this up really, really small, as small as possible. And then I'm going to work on rubbing the butter into the flour, and all the time again I am thinking about my intentions, and I am holding my hands over, pushing my energy into the ingredients, as well as blowing my intentions and speaking my intentions aloud as I rub the butter into the flour mixture.
Oh, it feels nice and soft.
Yeah, and the butter feels cool, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, it does. So you rub it together, you rub the butter and the flour together, and you have to think of all of the joy.
I know a secret ingredient of this.
Oh, you do? Pumpkins. Well, there is some pumpkin spice in this pastry. Not a lot, just a little bit. And then there's going to be some pumpkin in the main bit.
When the secret ingredient.
I think people might be able to tell when they see the orange colour.
I've tasted this pie before.
It's going to be nice, isn't it? So I have one egg here, and it's fridge cold, and again I'm just going to push my energy and intention into the egg for growth and fortification and blessings. And I've whisked this up, and now I'm mixing it into the rest of the pastry ingredients, and it's just going to come together in the bowl, and I'm just going to push it together into a disc. I don't want to work it too much because you don't want a stiff pastry. So I'm taking about 2/3 and wrapping it up and putting the other third away as well. And this is the 2/3 after it's been in the freezer for about 20 minutes, which makes it really, really nice and cold to work with. It's much easier to roll out, and it's much easier to keep it whole. Not that I managed to do that very well, but using a bit of flour for my board and for the pastry, but you don't want too much because you don't want to change the structure of the pastry. So now I'm doing my best to place the rolled out pastry into my pie dish, but I do always find I have little holes to fill, so that's absolutely fine. I have stuff on the edge and I just work it in, and it's pretty rustic, but I like it that way. And I'm using a fork to prick the bottom of it so it doesn't rise up and have any air bumps underneath it. I'm putting in some baking parchment, and then these are my baking beads. They're just red lentils, but if you have any baking beads, by all means. So for the pumpkin pie filling, I'm starting with a 450 gram can of pumpkin puree. You can make this yourself, but it's quite a faff. And I have 3 eggs, and I've already cracked these because I like to take out any shell that's left over and remove that before I blend it with anything. And I have 75 grams of caster sugar and 150 grams of light brown sugar here, and I am obviously putting all of my intentions into the sugar for sweetness and mixing that in with the eggs and the pumpkin puree. So I used the freestanding mixer, the KitchenAid, to whisk this up for a few minutes, and then I'm adding about a teaspoon of pumpkin spice, half a teaspoon of cinnamon, a quarter teaspoon of ginger, and a teaspoon of vanilla extract, as well as 2 tablespoons of maple syrup, which I just love the flavour of. I think it just adds a really, really beautiful depth of smoky flavour. Some corn flour, about 1 tablespoon of corn flour. And then 225 mils of double cream goes in. Again, all the time talking over the mixture and thinking about my intentions for each ingredient that goes in. And then adding the salt as well. Mixing it all together. And now I am rolling out the last little bit of pastry that I had, and I'm going to create a little pumpkin face to go onto the pie. So I have baked my base with the baking beans or lentils, and that is now set aside and cooling. I need to cool it and then add an egg wash to it and then bake that again for another 5 minutes or so. It ends up baking for about 15 to 20 minutes in total before any of the filling goes in, and that just means you don't get a soggy bottom. I'm using the leftover pastry here and just cutting it into a pumpkin shape, which was really, really fun, and just went with like a classic pumpkin happy face, which I thought was cute. And not perfect, rustic, that's just the way I like it, to be honest. And there is the finished pie base with the egg wash that has now been set, and I'm adding in my pumpkin pie mix, and then I'm just going to pop my little pumpkin face on top, and yeah, it looks really, really rustic and cute. I wanted to do the face of Jack from Nightmare Before Christmas, but I didn't have enough pastry for that. So I'm adding an egg wash and then baking it in the oven for about 40 minutes at about 170 degrees centigrade. So here are the little mini pumpkin pies that I made with the leftover pastry and some of the leftover pumpkin pie mixture. And there's still lots more left over, so I've labelled it and put it in the freezer. So I'll just whip up another batch of pastry another time and we can have some more. So I've chosen the little rustic one to eat, so I'm just going to see how it looks. It looks good. Let's give it a try. It's like egg custardy, isn't it? I really, really hope that you enjoyed seeing that. Do let me know if you give it a try and any other things that you plan to make this season. I'd love to hear. Also, for ideas, if you're looking for some, circle round. I always reference this. I think it's such a great book. There are stories and songs in here. There's a recipe for Bread of the Dead, a Samhain apple chain, sugar skulls, Dolly. There's the story of Vasilia and Baba Yaga. And it's just a fantastic book to reference. Also, this is a book that I have read since Mabon. I absolutely love this book. I devoured it. I think Diana Rachel is a fantastic author, and I do think that this series by Llewellyn is really, really good because you get lots of lovely craft ideas and recipes. There are rituals in here for couples as well as people alone, solo rituals to connect to your ancestors, to connect to different deities. There are prayers for deities, to the fae, to the ancestors, divination methods and rituals, crafts, incenses, how to make a partial here. So there are so many wonderful things that you can do. Decoupage. There is a recipe in here that I was thrilled to see for pain de myrteau, which is bread of the dead, and I was so pleased to see that this recipe does not have aniseed in it. So if I'm going to make Bread of the Dead, I will likely use this recipe in here from Diana Rachel. Love spells, protection spells, blessings, speaking to your ancestors, healing grief, all sorts of beautiful, beautiful rituals, spells and ideas in this book, so definitely pick it up if you want to learn more. I always read the section on each aspect of the season in this book. I think this is just so fantastic for the history, and you know that Ronald Hutton is a scholar, so of course this is a really, really good place to go to verify what you're reading in other more neo-pagan books. And of course, I always reference this. This is by Tiffany Lazic. This is the Noble Art. This is From Shadow to Essence Through the Wheel of the Year. Now, this is working through the Wheel of the Year from a more psycho-spiritual place. Now, I think this is fantastic for those people who sort of feel a little bit bored or a bit disillusioned and a bit kind of like meh about the Wheel of the Year. Many pagans and witches and Wiccans alike do celebrate the Wheel of the Year, but I have noticed that many witches just prefer not to celebrate the Sabbats anymore, or even celebrate some and not others, and I think that's wonderful, because I do think it's fantastic to cultivate your own Wheel of the Year based on where you are and what nature is actually doing around you. I think that's so, so valuable and key. But one thing I think people are kind of bored and don't want to reference the same material that comes from this idea of one homogenous Wheel of the Year, and sort of perpetuates this idea that it's always been this ancient way of celebrating, which of course we know is not true. I think some people seem to be quite disillusioned by that idea, and I think that this book is a really great way to explore the themes and topics of the season in a shadow work kind of way. It's something to engage you with the work at this time and really, really help you to work through things that you've experienced, grief, trauma, loss, etc., and deepens you into the season in a way that's reflective and really, really nourishing, like really spiritually nourishing. You're like excavating, do you know what I mean? It's like real shadow work, and I think it's just really, really beautiful to engage in practices like this, engage with this kind of content throughout the Wheel of the Year, so that you are immersing yourself in the season, but you don't have to do the same things that are in the books that people talk about all the time at these different Sabbats. So I think that that's really valuable, and if you're one of those people who feel like that a little bit, then I definitely recommend getting this book. Tiffany brought out another book before this, The Great Work, which I have not read, but I plan to work with this for a few years and then get The Great Work and then work with that and then kind of work with both of them ongoing. It's definitely a book that you work with throughout a year, and it is so valuable. I'm still working through this Samhain portion. What Tiffany Lazic talks about here are the unseen, the theme of death and protection, and the otherworldly connection that comes up. Really what Tiffany goes into here is about our deepest fears, about our inabilities to heal, our fears of losing love, of being alone, and we've talked about this in previous Sabbats as well. She says here, one of the best things about the celebration of Samhain is how it turns our fears into wonders, and that really is the beauty of Halloween at this time of year. And I mean, many pagans and witches do consider the two to be separate, Halloween and Samhain, and I do too, because I celebrate quite a commercial Halloween with my children and my family, and I get into the spirit of like the horror and the scary, the spooky. I love that, but also the deeper, more reverent, meaningful, spiritual, connective aspects of Samhain I really, really deeply connect to as well. And my ancestor altar is up in that side of the room, and it's up all year round. It means so much to me to be able to have that connection to my loved ones. Sometimes I find that I'm nervous to approach it or afraid to speak to my loved ones, but this time of year makes it easier in a way. It sort of feels like everything is aligned for that, and just honouring them is so, so powerful, and it's something that I really intend to do on Samhain this year. So I do feel that Samhain and Halloween both honour and celebrate our deepest fears very, very well, because we are honouring and revering what has gone, celebrating those we have lost, and with Halloween we are delving a little bit into our shadows and what lies beneath, and looking at the scary, and really I think it's beautiful. I really, really do. I mean, so many people think that Halloween is trite and silly, but I think it is wonderful, and it is one of my favourite times of year. It always has been. Tiffany continues to talk about life as loss and working through that and healing the trauma and the pain of that. The shadow of cycle 8 is ungrieved losses. She talks about the importance of being able to grieve our losses, and essentially that's the kind of work that we're doing here. And then there's meditations. Essentially with this book you don't get a list of journal prompts. Instead you have to read the text, and she will ask questions within the text, and then there are things like rituals and meditations to connect with, but really it sparks sparks these questions and conversations within you so that you begin to get an idea, a glimpse into how you feel about these things and what might come up. And what I think is really nice is to read a few pages or a chapter and let it marinate for a few evenings and journal about what comes up. And there was some journaling I did on this that lasted me for several days, because I had to go deep into something and then deeper and deeper and deeper, and it takes you through, just as shadow work, really good shadow work does. It takes you through, and ultimately it's an alchemical journey to harmony and healing. That's what it says on the back. That's how I would definitely describe it. So it's just a little bit about the Samhain section in this book. I really, really hope that you've enjoyed listening to some of the history, the folklore, the celebrations, things that you can do at this time of year, the correspondences. I absolutely love talking about the Sabbath. It is one of my favourite things to do. If you did enjoy the video, I'd love it if you could leave me a little pumpkin emoji at the bottom. Please do like, share, subscribe if you're not already subscribed, and leave me a comment below. I'd love to hear what you're doing this Samhain or Halloween. How do you celebrate? Do you celebrate both? Do you celebrate one and not the other? Or do you avoid it completely? Does it not align with you? Do you work with your ancestors? I would love to hear all about this. I want to know what you're doing, how you're celebrating, what you're making, what you're crafting, what spell work, rituals, etc. you're going to be doing. I want to hear all about it. Anything that you're comfortable telling me, of course. Let me know in the comments box below. Leave a pumpkin emoji, like, share, comment, subscribe. If you've been watching my channel and you've not yet subscribed, please do subscribe. Click the thumbs up button to be notified whenever I create and upload videos just like this. Also, if you'd like to support me, I have an Instagram page that I'm fairly active on. I have TikTok. I also have a Patreon where I share new and full moon full forecasts, including herbs and crystals to work with at each lunation, what the planets are doing in the skies and how that's affecting you, and ways in which you can mitigate some of the more malefic aspects in the skies at the time, if there are any, and how you can really work with those more benefic aspects as well in order to manifest or release whatever it is that you're working on. That's all available on my Patreon, as well as custom made Book of Shadows pages where I share recipes and rituals and spells that I have shared on the channel. Not all of them, but some of them, and I would like to create further tiers where I share more of those. I would also like to share more private videos as well. There's some things I would like to talk about that I feel would be more appropriate to talk about them on Patreon, so that is my plan. It is just time at this point. If you'd like to go support me there, I'd love to have you. And also, if you would like to support me with a one-time donation, there is the super thanks down below, or I have a buy me a coffee page, or I have a direct PayPal link as well if you would like to support me in that way. Of course, there is no pressure to do so. You just being here, liking, sharing, subscribing, commenting means the absolute world to me. Thank you so much for being here. It makes this so worthwhile, because I obviously do spend quite a lot of time researching, putting together all of the information and filming and editing and bringing it all to you. It means so much to me to be able to do this, and of course if anyone is able to support, that just helps towards covering a little bit of some of the costs. So thank you so much for joining me. I hope that you have enjoyed this. I am wishing you an absolutely blessed Samhain and a really, really fun and safe Halloween. Sending you so many blessings, and I look forward to seeing you again really soon. Take care. Bye. Mwah.